The letter arrived on a Thursday in February, and Petra Wells almost threw it away. She had been at her kitchen table in Berkeley for 3 hours. Draft chapters everywhere. Coffee cups, a stack of loan statements she kept moving around, but never addressed. The envelope was from a law office in Bridgeport, California. Thin and formal, she opened it. It took 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. A deed of property, original document dated September 14, 1879. The property, the Bodie Assay office, 427 Main Street, Bodie, California. The purchaser, Solomon Elias Cole of the state of California. Purchase price, $4. The deed had been held in trust by the law office since 1927, per the instructions of its last registered holder, a woman named Viola Cole, who had died that year and left instructions. Transfer the deed to her youngest living descendant working in historical research. That was Petra. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She looked at the deed. She looked at the loan statements. She set the loan statements aside. She thought about Solomon Elias Cole, whose name she had never heard in her life, and who had apparently bought a building in a California gold rush ghost town for $4 145 years ago. She thought about the way certain things wait. She was 27 years old. She had been accumulating debt at a rate she had stopped calculating, because the calculation was not useful. She had a research vision that her department found politically uncomfortable. She had a formal complaint in a file and a decision in that file that used the word contribution 7 times. And she had this, a deed of property from 1879, a name she had never heard, a building she had never seen, the specific, improbable gift of a distant ancestor who had bought a building for $4 and trusted a chain of careful people to hold it until the right moment. Viola had held it for 70 years. Ezra had believed in it for 40. Now it was Petra's. She thought about the way certain things wait. Then she called her grandfather. Ezra Cole was 83 years old and lived in Fresno, and had, in Petra's experience, strong opinions about 3 things: baseball, collard greens, and the erasure of black history in the American West. He was one of the reasons Petra had become an archaeologist. The other reason was stubbornness, which he had also given her. He answered on the first ring. "Grandpa," she said, "what do you know about Solomon Cole?" A pause. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "I just inherited his building." A longer pause. Then Ezra Cole laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and surprised. "Lord," he said, "Viola's trust finally paid out. You knew about this?" "I knew there was something in Bodie," he said. "Your grandmother's people." Viola always said the family had property out there. Everybody thought she was confused. 90 years old and still writing letters to lawyers. He paused. I guess she wasn't confused. Who was Solomon Cole? He was a free black man, Ezra said. Went to California in 1873 after Reconstruction started going wrong in South Carolina. He had an education, could read and write and do mathematics better than most anybody. His father had been a schoolteacher, one of the few black men in the state with that kind of formal training. He passed it to Solomon. The boy could do sums in his head faster than most men could write them down. A pause. He got work in the assay office in Bodie as a clerk and assistant to the assayer. Stayed there about 12 years. What happened to him? Ezra collected the way he always collected family stories, in layers. Each generation adding context to what the previous generation left incomplete. What happened to most people in Bodie? The mines started running dry, the town emptied out. He moved on eventually. Came to Fresno, met a woman named Clara, had children. A pause. He never talked about Bodie, not to his children, not to his grandchildren, just left it behind. Petra looked at the deed, at a man who bought a building for $4 and never talked about it again. "Grandpa," she said, "I think I need to go to Bodie. "I think you do too," he said. "And Petra," he paused. "When you get there, look carefully." She was 23 years old when she first understood what her research was really about. She had been an undergraduate at Howard, sitting in a seminar on the material culture of the American West. Her professor, Dr. Aldridge, had put two photographs side by side on the projector. One was a formal portrait from a San Francisco studio, circa 1878. A Chinese man in his 40s, standing straight, looking directly at the camera. Underneath the portrait, in faded pencil, Li Ah Kao, railroad worker. The other was an 1878 illustration from a major San Francisco newspaper. A scene from a Sierra Nevada gold camp. Dozens of figures working, dynamiting, building, not one Chinese face visible. Though by 1878, Chinese workers had built most of California's railroad infrastructure and worked significant portions of its mines. They were there, Dr. Aldridge had said. They were absolutely there. The material record confirms it, the artifacts, the structures, the specific techniques that could only have come from their labor. But the documentary record, the newspapers, the illustrations, the official accounts, had already decided who it wanted to see. Petra had looked at those two photographs for a long time. She had thought, someone needs to read the material evidence against the documentary record and document the gap. She had spent the next 4 years getting the training to do that. She had come to Berkeley because Berkeley had the archive access and the field opportunities that would let her do it properly. She had walked into Fitch's office believing, cautiously, with the specific optimism of someone who had worked very hard to get somewhere, that the discipline was ready for the argument she wanted to make. She had been wrong about the discipline being ready. She had been right about needing to make the argument anyway. She arranged the leave of absence in a single conversation. Her research had not come from nowhere. She had grown up in Fresno with Ezra, with the particular knowledge of being descendants of people who had come west under specific circumstances and had stayed and built something and had not been given adequate credit for building it. She had grown up hearing about California as a place where things had been possible for certain people and not for others, and that the things that had been possible or impossible had not been random. She had gone to Howard specifically because she had wanted to study American history without fighting constantly for the right to study whose history she wanted to study. She had come to Berkeley for the archive access and the field opportunities, knowing she was entering a different environment. She had been right about the difference. Her PhD supervisor, Dr. Lawrence Fitch, had been trying to shape her research into something more comfortable for 3 years. He called it important, consistently, with modifiers that accumulated over time. Important but peripheral. Important but perhaps more suited to a sociology department. Important but, and this was the one she heard most, perhaps more advocacy than scholarship. She had asked him, once, to explain that last one. He had said something about political valence and the importance of distance from the subject. She had understood what he meant. His definition of neutral research was research centered on people who looked like him, which was a very specific thing to call neutral. She had filed that. She had gone back to work. Then, 6 months ago, a major journal had published an article drawing substantially on her preliminary research, the archival work she had shared with Fitch in confidence over 2 years of meetings. The article cited her twice, in footnotes, as a research contributor. She had filed a formal complaint. The investigation concluded that proper attribution had been provided. The word contribution appeared in the conclusion 7 times. She put the conclusion in a file. She went back to work. She had been an exceptional undergraduate. Her professors at Howard had said so plainly, without hedge. She had arrived at Berkeley with a fully formed research vision, a comprehensive archaeological study of the material culture left behind by Black Americans in the California gold rush communities, using physical evidence to reconstruct an experience that the written record had systematically erased. She had spent 3 years watching that vision get squeezed. The suggestions that her framing was too political. The assumption that rigorous scholarship required distance from the subject, but only for scholars whose subjects happened to be people who looked like them. The 2022 article that had absorbed 2 years of her preliminary research and credited her in footnotes. She had learned to document everything. She had kept her records as carefully as Solomon Cole had kept his. For the same reason, because the true account was worth maintaining regardless of whether the official account confirmed it. Now she sat across from Fitch and told him she was taking a leave. Now she sat across from Fitch and told him she was taking a leave to investigate an inherited property with direct relevance to her dissertation research. He said he didn't think a leave was advisable at this stage. She said she was taking it regardless, and would he prefer to facilitate it, or would she go to the graduate division directly? He facilitated it. She drove to Bodie on a Tuesday morning in March, the high desert opening around her as she climbed east on Highway 395. She had been thinking about the drive for 3 weeks, not the logistics. She had the permit, the field kit, the motel booked in Bridgeport. She had been thinking about what she was going toward. She had spent 3 years arguing that the official record of who built California was incomplete, that the specific mechanisms by which certain kinds of labor were made economically invisible, the credit manipulation, the contract fraud, the falsification of measurement at every point where the value of non-white labor was assessed, had left a gap between what had actually happened and what the documented record showed. She had made that argument from secondary sources, from the patterns visible in incomplete records, from the material evidence of daily life that physical archaeology could reconstruct. She had never had a primary source. She might have one now. She drove east on Highway 395, and the argument she had been building for 3 years felt, for the first time, like it had a foundation that could hold its weight. She thought about the specific shape of that foundation. The material record was always there, the objects people left behind, the wear patterns on surfaces, the architectural arrangements that testified to how spaces had been used. You could read a lot from material evidence. You could reconstruct the broad outline of how people had lived and worked it and organized themselves. But the documentary record was different. Documents could be deliberately produced to say things that weren't true, could be shaped by the people who wrote them to serve the interests of the people who commissioned them. The Assay certificate that said 60% of the ore's true value was a document. It was real in the sense that it physically existed. It was not accurate. Solomon Cole's ledger was a document too. It was real in the same sense. It was also accurate. The gap between the two documents was the gap she had been arguing existed for 3 years. She had just never been able to point to a specific, datable, verifiable instance of it in the California gold rush context. She drove east, and the mountains rose on her right, and the high desert opened ahead of her, and she thought, now I can. She had been reading about the Assay office for 2 days before the drive, pulling everything she could find on the structure, the original construction, the period of operation. Assay offices of the 1870s were built to specific functional requirements. A furnace for the fire assay process, scales precise to 1/100th of a grain, a desk for paperwork and record keeping. And almost universally, in offices of this size and period, some form of secure overnight storage for sensitive materials. She had read about false bottom drawers in her research 2 years earlier. Filed it in the place where archaeologists file things they find interesting but don't yet have a use for. She drove east and thought about false bottom drawers. The landscape changed as she climbed. Dry scrub on the valley floor, then juniper and sage on the plateau, then the wide open country of the Bodie Hills, where the land is brown and gold and the sky feels very close and the wind is always present. She turned off the highway onto the Bodie Road and drove the last 13 miles on washboarded dirt. The desert spread away on every side. Ahead, in a shallow bowl between the hills, Bodie. From a distance, it looked like a movie set. Photographs don't prepare you for the scale of the absence. More than 200 buildings still standing, in various states of decline. The main street with its wooden sidewalks intact. The church still with its steeple, mine machinery visible on the hillside. All of it in exactly the state it had reached when the last residents left. Not restored, not rebuilt, just stopped. This was what arrested decay meant, materially. Not ruin. Ruin says time has won. Arrested decay says, we stopped, we were here, and then we stopped. She understood why people found Bodie eerie. She found it something else. She found it extraordinarily readable. Every detail was evidence. Every object left in place was testimony. The curtains still hanging in the Donnelly house. You don't take your curtains if you leave in a hurry. The equipment in the stamp mill still in operating position. Testament to the expectation that operations would resume. Solomon Cole had worked in this place for 12 years. Whatever he had left here was still here. She had wanted to work here for 3 years. Now she was here, and his deed was in her pocket. The ranger at the visitor center was a man named Derek, 40-ish, with the sunburned practicality of someone who spent his working life outdoors at 7,000 feet. He had been expecting her. She'd called ahead and sent the deed documentation 3 days before. She had also sent her academic credentials. She had sent all of it because she had learned, over 3 years, that certain spaces required you to arrive pre-justified. That showing up and assuming your presence would be taken as professionally legitimate was not always safe to assume. She had learned this the way Black women learn it, through the specific, accumulated experience of rooms where you arrived and watched people recalibrate. When she introduced herself, Derek had that expression. The processing of the gap between the person expected and the person who had arrived. "Ms. Wells," he said. "That's right," she said. He told her the state had acquired all private property in Bodie through eminent domain between 1961 and 1964. He told her any private deed from 1879 would typically have been extinguished through that process. Typically, she said. He told her the specific parcel at 427 Main Street was complicated. The 1962 acquisition records were incomplete. There may be a question about whether Solomon Cole's deed was properly extinguished. "Maybe," she said. He allowed her 30 minutes inside the building. He would be right outside. 30 minutes was enough. 427 Main Street, Bodie, California. The Assay office was smaller than Petra had expected. A single-story frame building, maybe 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep, with a false front that gave it the commercial grandeur Bodie's merchants had favored in the 1870s. The sign above the door had long since lost its lettering, but the ghost of it was still visible in the weathered wood. Derek unlocked the door and stepped aside. Petra stepped in. The smell hit her first. Old wood and stone and something older. The smell of a space that has been closed for a long time and has forgotten what outside air feels like. She stood still for a moment. She read from large to small, structure first, then features, then details, then the marks and traces that were the smallest evidence of use. She swept her flashlight slowly across the space. The Assay furnace against the back wall, sitting on a raised brick platform, about 8 inches high, running the full width of the furnace. She noted it, filed it. There was something about the mortar on the front face, a section of different tone, slightly paler, about 14 inches wide. Not the same aging pattern as the surrounding brick. She photographed it, filed it. A scale on the work table, the kind used to weigh gold dust with exactness. Filing cabinets, drawers hanging open, empty, and behind a wooden counter, the assayer's desk. Large, solid oak, made for a man who expected to spend long hours at it. The wear at the writing area. The depth of the groove where a pen had rested. The specific damage to the front edge where hands had braced against it repeatedly. This was the desk of a man who had spent his working life here. She thought about Solomon Cole at this desk, 8 hours a day for 8 years. She opened the drawers in turn. Empty, 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 empty. She stood at the right side drawers. She opened the bottom one and looked at it carefully. The drawer was 12 inches deep. She measured the desk's overall depth on the right side with the tape from her kit, 19 inches. She measured the left side drawers, 16 inches each, consistent with the desk's depth on the left, which was 16. The structural difference between the two sides of the desk explained itself. The right side had a wider base supporting the heavier work surface above the drawer bank, which meant the right side drawers should measure 19 inches. The bottom right drawer measured 12, 7 inches unaccounted for. She had read about hidden compartments, practical false bottom drawers used to secure sensitive records overnight. Simple, unobtrusive, invisible to anyone who didn't know to measure. She pressed her fingers along the bottom of the drawer, along the sides. She took a breath. She pressed inward at the front corners. The bottom of the drawer dropped forward on a hinge. Below it, a space 7 inches deep and the full width of the drawer. Inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and dark with age, a book. She did not open it in the building. She photographed the compartment. She photographed the book in place. She photographed the mechanism. She documented the chain of custody the way she had been trained. When she came out, Derek looked at her hands. "I need to talk to your supervisor," she said. "I found something." She read it that evening in her motel room in Bridgeport. She was not going to open a 140-year-old document in a hurry. It took her 45 minutes to prepare. Fresh gloves, clean plastic sheet on the table. The book laid on it, opened slowly and carefully. The oilcloth had done its job. The ledger's pages were yellowed and brittle at the edges, but the writing was legible, very legible, meticulous. Small, precise handwriting. Entries dated from September 1877 through March 1885. Each one had a date, a mine name, a sample number, a submitted assay result, an actual assay result, and a difference column. She read the first several entries and understood immediately what she was looking at. The submitted assay result, the number that had gone on the official certificate, the number that determined what the mine owner paid their workers. The actual assay result, what the ore truly yielded. The difference column, how much lower the submitted number was. Sometimes 5%, sometimes 15%. One entry, for a mine she recognized as a large Hartley operation, showed a difference of 38%. She had encountered assay fraud in the secondary literature before. The pattern was established. The assayer's certificate was the essential intermediary between ore and payment. When that certificate was deliberately undervalued, consistently, always in the same direction, the excess went directly to the mine owner. It required the assayer's cooperation. Solomon Cole had been the clerk who did the actual chemical work. He had produced the true numbers. Someone else had converted them into false ones for the official record. Solomon had kept both. She turned to the back of the ledger, a separate section headed, "Account of gold dust held in trust." dated entries recording deposits, a mine name and amount, a corresponding reference to the main ledger. At the bottom of the last page, a total, 41,750, in gold dust. As of March 1885, she set the ledger down. She sat in the motel room, with the high desert outside the window and the stars very bright at this altitude, and she thought about what a man does when he watches something wrong happen every day for 8 years and cannot stop it through normal channels. He documents it. He measures the gap between the false account and the true one. He holds the difference in physical form, in gold, which does not corrode, which maintains its true weight against the false accounting that generated it. She turned to the very last page of the ledger. The note was there, written in the same careful hand. Less formal, more direct, it said. I am writing this because I know that what is recorded in the official ledger of this office is not the truth. I've spent 8 years measuring things precisely and recording them honestly, and I have watched dishonest numbers go into the official record while I kept the honest numbers here. The difference between these numbers represents wages owed to miners who were paid on the basis of the false figures. These men were cheated. Most of them could not read the assay certificates well enough to know it. I have set aside the difference in gold dust held in this office with the intention that it be returned to the men who worked for it. I have tried to do this through legitimate means and have been told that my concerns are not supported by the evidence. I am leaving this record here in the belief that one day someone will find it who understands what it means and knows what to do with it. I am not a man who forgets what is owed. Below that, a name and a date. Solomon Elias Cole, March 15, 1885. Petra read the note 3 times, then a 4th. There was a particular quality to the writing she had learned to recognize over years of reading 19th century primary sources. The quality of someone writing for posterity, writing with the knowledge that the words would need to stand alone. Writing carefully because accuracy was the only thing you could offer the future. He had written this note once, in March 1885, and then walked out and locked the door and never come back. He had written it, knowing he might be the only person ever to read it, and he had written it anyway. I am not a man who forgets what is owed. 10 words at the end of 8 years of careful documentation. Not a declaration of heroism, not a claim to recognition, just a statement of fact about who he was. She put the note down. She looked at the ceiling. She sat with it. She thought about what it cost to write a note like that. Not the risk, though the risk was real, and the Whitmore letter she had not yet found would later confirm exactly how real. The internal cost. The cost of holding what you know over years while the official version says something different. Of keeping the honest numbers in a hidden drawer while the dishonest numbers go into the official record, week after week, year after year. And then, at the end, not writing a declaration of heroism, not writing a grievance, just writing, I am not a man who forgets what is owed, a statement of fact about who he was. That was not stubbornness. That was something older and steadier than stubbornness. That was the specific, unremarkable courage of a person who has decided that the true account of things is worth maintaining regardless of whether anyone in authority will confirm it. She had her own version of that, 3 years of it, maintaining her own true account of her research, while the institutional account said something different, keeping her records carefully. Going back to work, she looked at Solomon's handwriting on the page. She thought, he knew something that I have spent 3 years learning to name. She put the note down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about what Solomon Cole had understood in 1877. He had walked into the Bodie Assay office as a clerk with an education and good numbers in a territory where those qualities were not universally rewarded when they came in his particular form. He had understood immediately what kind of operation he was working in. He had understood the specific mechanics of how the false number was produced and how it moved from the assay table to the certificate to the payroll. He had done the honest work anyway, not because he was naive about what it would cost, not because he thought the honest work would be acknowledged, but because he was a man who kept records, and the honest number was the record, and the record was worth keeping, regardless of whether the official account confirmed it. She had been doing the same thing, in a different context, with different tools. She had been keeping the honest numbers, the careful documentation of the argument her department preferred not to acknowledge, the record of her contributions that the official attribution had classified differently, because the record was worth keeping regardless. Solomon Cole had locked his records in a hidden drawer and trusted the future to find them. She had locked hers in a file and went back to work. Different scale, same principle. She called Ezra the next morning. She told him everything: the ledger, the hidden drawer, the note, the gold dust account, the $41,000. Ezra was quiet for a long time. March 1885, he said finally. That's when he left Bodie. He came back to South Carolina first to see what was left of the family. Then he came to Fresno, met Clara, had children. A pause. He died in 1912. He never talked about it, not a word to anyone. He documented it, Petra said. 8 years of records. He was a careful man, Ezra said. Your grandmother always said that. Solomon Cole was the most careful man God ever made. A pause. What are you going to do? I need an attorney, Petra said, and I need to understand what happened to the $41,000. Because it might still be there, Ezra said. It might be somewhere, she said. It's been 140 years, but Solomon put it somewhere before he left. He locked the ledger in the desk so someone could follow the trail. He wrote, held in this office. Not elsewhere, in this office. He trusted the building, Ezra said. He locked it in and trusted someone would come. He trusted me, Petra said. Even before I was born. Ezra was quiet. Go find it, he said. Before she found the attorney, there were 3 days at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. The official Bodie Assay office records were in the collection. Not complete, but substantial. Registers spanning much of the period covered by Solomon's ledger. She pulled them and sat at a long research table with the ledger photographs on her laptop and the official registers before her, and she began to compare. 12 hours over 3 days. The pattern was unmistakable. 47 specific instances where a mine name, a date, and a sample number appeared in both the official registers and Solomon's hidden ledger. In 47 out of 47 cases, the number in Solomon's ledger, as the actual assay result, was higher than the number in the official register. A consistent discrepancy in one direction across 47 samples over 8 years was not random variation. Random variation goes both ways. A consistent undercount in the official record was not an accident. She spent the afternoon at the Bancroft, going through the same records she'd used in her dissertation research, looking at them differently now. Looking for the Whitmore-era assay operations specifically. Looking for the anomalies that would confirm or contradict what she had found in Solomon's hidden drawer. The pattern she found in the official registers was exactly what she'd expected, exactly what 47 cross-references would confirm. She closed her notebook on the third evening and thought about the argument she had been making for 3 years. The argument Dr. Fitch had called potentially overstated. That the economic exclusion of Black Californians from the wealth of the gold rush had been primarily a function of informal economic mechanisms. The fraud, the credit manipulation, the systematic falsification of measurement at every point where the value of black labor was assessed. She had made that argument from secondary sources and material evidence. Now she had a primary source, and in one of the personnel folders, she found the Whitmore Letter. She also found something she hadn't been looking for. In a personnel folder labeled Assay Office Staff 1877 to 1885, there was a single sheet, a letter from the head assayer, a man named Whitmore, to the Mine Owners Association of Bodie, dated January 1885, 2 months before Solomon left. The letter was a complaint. It described a staff member maintaining unauthorized secondary documentation and expressing concerns about the validity of certain certified results. It requested that the Mine Owners Association address this situation promptly. The Mine Owners Association response was written in the margin, in a different hand. Agreed. Terminate at end of quarter. Solomon's departure in March 1885 had not been voluntary. He had been fired. She sat with that for a long time. A man who had just been terminated, who knew he was going to be terminated, who had 2 months to decide what to do, and had written 11 words. I am not a man who forgets what is owed. Not anger, not grievance, not accusation, just a statement of fact about who he was. The Whitmore Letter changed everything. The Hartley family's later claim that the ledger was unauthorized would now collide with the mine owners themselves, having characterized it as exactly that. In writing, in January 1885, they had known. The successor company had reason to know. She photographed the Whitmore Letter. She added it to the documentation. She sat at the research table for a long time after she found it. She thought about what the Whitmore Letter changed, not the substance of what she had found. Solomon's ledger was already what it was. The 47 cross-references were already documented. The $41,000 was already recorded. The Whitmore Letter didn't add to the evidence of fraud. What it added was the evidence of suppression, active, deliberate suppression. The mine owners had known about the secondary documentation. They had known in January 1885, 2 months before Solomon left. They had made a specific, recorded decision to eliminate it, which meant the Hartley family's later claim that the ledger was of uncertain provenance, as if it might be a fabrication, as if its origins were unclear, would now collide with the mine owners themselves having characterized it as exactly what it was. An unauthorized secondary record. A second set of books. The origin of the ledger was not uncertain. The Whitmore Letter confirmed it with the handwriting of the people who had wanted it destroyed. She called her attorney. Vera Singh was a property and cultural heritage attorney in Sacramento who had handled several cases involving disputed historical claims to California Gold Rush-era properties. She read Petra's documentation and called the following day. "Tell me about the Hartley family," Vera said. Petra frowned. "I don't know the Hartley family." "You will," Vera said. 3 of the largest mines in Bodie in the 1870s and 1880s were operated by subsidiaries of the Hartley Mining Company. At least 11 entries in your ledger reference Hartley-affiliated mines. A pause. "I did a quick search this morning. The Hartley family maintains a foundation in San Francisco that promotes the history of the California gold industry. And they've been aware of your property claim since you filed the access documentation with the State Parks Office." "How do you know they've been aware?" "Because their attorney called my office this morning," Vera said. "Before I called you." Petra thought about what mutually beneficial arrangement would require of her. She had been told her research was potentially overstated enough times to know exactly what that phrase meant in practice. "Don't talk to them," Vera said. "Let me handle the contact. And Petra, these foundations have been managing the narrative about the California gold rush for 100 years. They're going to try to make this expensive and slow. That's how they win. I know what good faith offers designed to produce a particular outcome look like, Petra said. Okay, Vera said. Let's get to work. She looked up the Hartley Foundation that evening. Elegant website. Photographs of historic mining operations. A mission statement about celebrating the entrepreneurial spirit of the gold rush. A family history section describing the Hartleys as models of responsible mining practice. She read their summary of Bodie's history. It mentioned the Assay office briefly. It did not mention Solomon Cole. She was not surprised, but she sat with the not surprise for a while. She had done her research on Claire Hartley in the 10 days since Vera's call, executive director of the foundation. Stanford undergraduate, Wharton MBA, a person who had spent her professional life presenting the Hartley family's history as California's history, who had described Solomon Cole's ledger in the foundation's initial legal communication as materials of uncertain historical significance. Before the state park's archaeologist authenticated it. After the authentication, the language had shifted to materials of clear historical interest. The interest level appeared to correlate with the legal pressure. The knock on her door came on a Thursday morning in March. 2 people, Claire Hartley in her mid-50s, well-dressed in the specific way of old California money, understated, expensive, effortlessly confident, and behind her, a man about the same age in a suit that fit perfectly. Ms. Wells, Claire said. I'm Claire Hartley. I believe we have some matters to discuss. My attorney handles all correspondence related to the Bodie property, Petra said. Claire looked at Petra's apartment, the stacks of drafts, the research books, the boxes of archival copies, with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. The expression of someone visiting a place where the resident deserves more, while simultaneously believing the resident is not equipped to acquire it. I understand you've been doing important work, Claire said. Solomon Cole's role in the Bodie community is something the foundation has always wanted to explore. Petra noted the always, as if the foundation had been actively interested before 8 weeks ago. I'd like to understand your interest in Solomon Cole's ledger, Petra said. Something moved through Claire's expression. Not surprise. A recalibration. We're interested in the historical significance of all the materials associated with the Assay office, Claire said carefully. Solomon Cole worked in that office for 8 years, Petra said. He kept meticulous records. Those records document that 11 mines affiliated with the Hartley Mining Company submitted fraudulent assay certificates between 1877 and 1885. The fraudulent certificates undervalued the ore by amounts ranging from 20 to 40%. Workers were paid based on the fraudulent values. The difference was held by Solomon Cole in trust, with the intention of returning it to the miners. She paused. That's what's in the ledger. Is that the aligned interest you're referring to? The man behind Claire spoke for the first time. His voice was controlled and even. That's a significant accusation based on a document of uncertain provenance, accusing a family of historical misconduct without corroborating evidence. I have 8 years of corroborating evidence, Petra said. I have the official Bodie Assay office registers at the Bancroft Library. I spent 3 days cross-referencing them with Solomon Cole's ledger. The discrepancies are consistent, documentable, and specific. 47 instances, all in the same direction. I also have a letter from your family's mine managers directing the assayer's office to terminate the employee who was maintaining the true records. She paused. January 1885. Agreed. Terminate at end of quarter. Your foundation's own predecessors confirmed the ledger existed and chose to suppress it. The man's expression changed. Not anger. Something colder. The expression of a person who had walked in with a conclusion already drawn and is encountering a fact that doesn't fit. She had been watching that expression across desks and conference tables for 3 years. "What do you want?" Claire said. "I want the historical record to be accurate," Petra said. "I want the workers who were cheated to be in the record. I want Solomon Cole to be in the record. I want what he did, 8 years of careful documentation at personal risk, to matter." She paused. "My attorney handles everything else." "We'll be in touch with your attorney," Claire said. They left. Petra stood in her apartment. She thought about Solomon Cole at his desk in 1877, doing the honest work that the official record would not acknowledge, keeping the true numbers in a hidden drawer. She was not in a hidden drawer, she called Vera. She thought about the confrontation as she waited for Vera to answer. About Claire Hartley's expression when Petra had laid out the ledger's contents. The recalibration. The way the conversation they had planned. The gentle, reasonable conversation in which they offered Petra a mutually beneficial arrangement and she accepted it, had encountered the reality of who she was and what she knew and had had to adjust. She had watched that adjustment happen in rooms her entire career. In department meetings when she asked questions that disrupted the assumed consensus. In grant review panels where her research was described as important but potentially too specific. In the expression on Fitch's face when she first described what she wanted her dissertation to argue. The look that said, "I came in expecting one kind of person, and the person who actually arrived is different. And I am deciding right now how to adjust my approach." She had learned not to accommodate it. She had learned that accommodating it was how you ended up with your research in someone else's footnotes. She called Vera. The Hartley Foundation's legal strategy became clear over 3 weeks. They challenged the deed's validity. They submitted a competing historical analysis arguing Solomon Cole's ledger records should be understood as preliminary notes, rather than definitive alternative assay results. They requested the State Parks Agency prevent public disclosure pending proper historical contextualization. Vera moved quickly on the disclosure injunction. It was denied in 10 days. The competing historical analysis was more concerning. Petra read the report carefully. She identified 7 factual errors and 3 mischaracterizations of the chemistry involved. She sent Vera a detailed response with annotations. Vera sent it to the Hartley Foundation's attorney without comment. The attorney responded 3 days later, requesting to discuss settlement terms. Dr. Rose Chen at the California State Parks Department became the unexpected turning point. Dr. Chen was in her 50s, a specialist in California environmental and social history, with a focus on the gold rush era. She had been officially neutral, as her agency's role required, but she had read the authentication materials carefully and she did not hesitate. "I need to tell you something," she said in the first call. "I have been writing about the Bodie mining operations for 15 years. I have always known that the assay process was subject to manipulation. I have never had primary documentation of it. I have never been able to say specifically how it worked and who it affected and by how much." She paused. "Your ledger says specifically. It says how and who and how much." "Solomon Cole's ledger," Petra said. "Solomon Cole's ledger," Dr. Chen agreed. "Will the State Parks Department say that publicly?" "Our agency has a complex relationship with the Hartley Foundation," Dr. Chen said. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't exist. I'm also not going to pretend it should determine what happens here." She paused. "I've been doing this work for 30 years. I have never seen a primary source document of this significance simply set aside. What do you need from me?" "The full academic case," Petra said, "in a form that a state bureaucracy can act on." "That's your dissertation," Dr. Chen said. A pause. "I know," Dr. Chen said. "I read the first 3 chapters. They're excellent." Petra held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about the citations that had become contribution, about 3 years of being told her research was important but peripheral. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Dr. Chen said. "Thank me when this is in the State Archive and the Hladan Panafunctions and lawyers have stopped calling." She had asked Dr. Chen once what she thought the Bodie ledger meant for how California taught its history. They had been standing outside the Assay office on the morning of the full documentation sweep in May. The desert was greening slightly. The wind was cold. "It means we need different questions," Dr. Chen said. "The questions we've been asking about the gold rush have been economic questions. How much was extracted? By which companies? At what period? Those questions produce a certain kind of history." She looked at the building. The questions this ledger forces are different. Not how much was extracted, but how much was paid. To whom, on the basis of what measurement, and who controlled the measurement? A pause. Once you ask those questions, the economic history looks different. "Whose labor built California?" Petra said. "And what happened to it?" Dr. Chen said. "And who decided what it was worth?" They stood in the early spring wind outside the Assay office. "Solomon Cole decided what it was worth," Petra said. "He did it in private, with a hidden ledger, because the official determination was dishonest. But he decided." Dr. Chen looked at her. "Yes," she said. "And now we have his decision." Derek the Ranger had become, by the second visit, something closer to an ally than an obstacle. He had stood in the field office in Bridgeport while the gold was weighed. He had driven back to Bodie that afternoon and caught Petra in the parking lot as she was leaving. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "When you first came in," he said, "with the deed, I didn't take it as seriously as I should have. I think I expected something different, and I let that affect how I responded." He paused. "That was wrong." She thought about the recalibration expression on the first day. "Thank you for saying so," she said. "The state park system should have been doing what you did 20 years ago," he said. "Reading this site properly. Understanding what's in it. We had the access. We just didn't have the question." She thought about that on the drive back. About who holds the keys to a site and what questions they think to ask. About how the official reading of a place depends entirely on who is doing the reading and what they have been trained to notice. Solomon Cole had known exactly what questions to ask. He had been asking them for 8 years. She had been trained to ask the same ones. She went back to Bodie in May. The desert was different in May. The winter's last snow melting off the hills, thin grass coming in green between the buildings, the light softer. The wind still present but warmer. She had 2 days this time and a specific task. From the first visit, she had filed the photograph of the furnace platform with its unusual mortar section. She had reread Solomon's note many times since then. He had written, "Held in this office, not elsewhere, not deposited in a bank. In this office." He had been a precise man. He would have been precise about where. And the furnace platform was the only structural feature in that office, with enough enclosed volume to hold the quantity of gold she had calculated. She spent the first day on a complete structural survey of the building. Every wall, every floor section, every ceiling joist visible from below, confirming what she suspected. On the second morning, she measured the platform directly. The front face, 9 inches high. The platform, 24 inches deep. She lay flat and shone her flashlight underneath the furnace to see the floor below. The floor was lower than expected, by approximately 7 inches. She stood up. She looked at the furnace, at the platform, at the section of the front face with the different mortar. The section that had been opened and repointed at some point. A space roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches high and 3 feet deep, enclosed in a brick platform, accessed through that section of front face. She called Derek. They opened it 2 days later. A state archaeologist supervised, full documentation, Vera on the phone, Dr. Chen on a conference call from Sacramento. Behind the repointed section of platform, in the space she had measured, 2 cast iron containers sealed with fitted lids. The containers were heavy, dense. They opened them at the Bridgeport field office. Gloves and tools, and people from the state archivist's office, and a conservation specialist, and Petra Wells, who sat on a folding chair in a government building in Mono County, and watched Solomon Cole's $41,000 come out of hiding after 140 years. The gold dust had consolidated under its own weight, dense, dark yellow-brown, smelling of something mineral and old. Dr. Torres weighed it carefully. 43 pounds, 11 ounces. Petra had calculated approximately 43 pounds based on Solomon's ledger entries. She had been right to within 2 ounces. He had been precise, exactly as precise as she had expected. Patricia Holt, the regional director, looked at the containers. She looked at Petra. Petra sat on the folding chair and looked at the gold. She had calculated approximately 43 pounds before the containers were opened, based on Solomon's ledger entries and the density of consolidated gold dust. She had been right to within 2 ounces. He had been precise, exactly as precise as she had expected him to be. He had recorded $41,750 in gold dust at 1880 prices, and 140 years later, the physical weight of that gold confirmed his numbers correct. She thought about Solomon at his desk in March 1885, writing the final entry, locking the ledger in the false bottom drawer, going to the furnace platform and opening the brick section and placing the cast iron containers inside, repointing the mortar, making it look like the rest, and then walking out of the building for the last time. Not defeated, not bitter, a man who had done what he could do in the conditions he actually faced, and had trusted the future to do what he could not do himself. 43 pounds, 11 ounces. Well, she said. Petra had nothing to add to that. Petra had nothing to add to that. The legal resolution took 14 months. The story broke nationally when the state archivist's office issued a press release. The calls came so fast Petra had to communicate through Vera's office. The Hartley Foundation issued 3 statements in 4 days. The first expressed support for historical research. The second expressed concern about the characterization of fraud, noting that business practices of the 19th century should be understood in their historical context. The third walked back concern and expressed a commitment to learning from the full historical record. Petra read all 3. She put them in a file. She found 22 families in the first 2 weeks. She also started meeting with former Bodie residents' descendants who had come forward after the press coverage. An 81-year-old man in Fresno, no relation to Petra's family, just a different Fresno family with roots in the Bodie labor force, who wept quietly when she told him his grandfather's name was in the ledger. He always said they cheated him, the man said. I thought he meant in general. I thought it was just something old men said. A pause. He meant specifically, Petra confirmed. A family from Baltimore who sent a long letter describing their grandmother's stories about Bodie, about the work and the conditions and the specific injustice she had never been able to prove. About the certificates she had kept because you keep documents even when you don't know what they're for. About the word objective she had used, not knowing the word exactly, but describing the thing. The way the official number was always described as neutral, as simply what the ore was worth, as if numbers existed outside of the hands that wrote them down. Petra read that letter twice. Then she called Ezra and read it to him. He was quiet for a long time. Solomon knew what he was doing, he said finally. He knew the official number was not neutral. He knew someone was choosing it, and he kept the unchosen number in a hidden drawer and trusted it to find the right hands. "It found them," Petra said. "It found them," Ezra said. Some of them called her after the story broke nationally. Some she found herself, through census records, genealogy databases, the specific research she had been doing for 3 years on exactly this population. A man in Pittsburgh whose great-grandfather had worked the Hartley Standard mine for 4 years. He always said the company cheated him, the man said. Everybody told him he was confused. He died thinking he was wrong. He paused. He wasn't confused. A woman in New Orleans who had her grandmother's letters from Bodie. Letters written home to Louisiana describing the work and the pay and the specific grievance that the numbers didn't add up right. She had kept them because they were her grandmother's handwriting. She had never known they were evidence. A high school history teacher in Sacramento named Diana Park, 45, whose great-great-grandfather's name appeared in the ledger 23 times. "Did he know?" she asked. "Do you think he knew he was being cheated?" Petra thought about that. "He may have suspected," she said. But the assay certificate was the official document, the thing with the stamp and the signature. For most people, that was the number. "He kept his certificates," Diana said. "My grandmother kept them in a box. I found them after she died. I kept them because I couldn't throw them away even though I didn't know why they mattered." A pause. "Now I know why. They matter," Petra said. Dr. Fitch emailed. He said the discovery was extraordinary and asked if she had thought about co-authoring something with him, a broader synthesis that could reach the widest possible audience. He said his institutional standing could help. She replied thanking him for the interest and noting she had already committed to a solo publication with the Journal of California History. She had not committed to it yet when she sent the email. She called the journal editor that afternoon and committed to it. The gold was held in trust while a historical claims process attempted to identify descendants of the workers named in Solomon's ledger. This took 9 months. Some families were found through census records, genealogy databases, immigration records, the specific research Petra had been doing for 3 years. A woman in Sacramento whose great-great-grandfather's name appeared 23 times. A man in Pittsburgh whose grandfather had always said the company cheated him and died thinking he was wrong. He wasn't confused, the man said. He wasn't confused at all. Most could not be definitively connected across 140 years of incomplete records. The portion that could not be specifically attributed was allocated by legislative action to a fund for historical research into California's Gold Rush era workers, with a specific mandate to focus on populations systematically excluded from the official record. The Hartley Foundation did not contest the gold question after the cast iron containers came out of the platform. Their lawyers filed one motion that was denied and went quiet. Claire Hartley released a statement expressing support for historical transparency and recognition of Solomon Cole's important historical role in documenting the Bodie mining era. She did not mention fraud. She did not mention the workers. Petra read it twice. She put it in a file. The paper was published in the Journal of California History in October. Lead article, 28 pages plus plates. The title, What Solomon Cole Knew, Fraud, Documentation, and Black Professional Life in the California Gold Rush Economy. The peer review process had included one reviewer who wrote a 3-page, deeply engaged response with specific suggestions for strengthening the argument, and one reviewer who wrote a paragraph suggesting the paper's framing might unintentionally introduce perspective into what should be a neutral historical analysis. She revised in response to the first reviewer. She responded to the second by strengthening her argument in exactly the places where the reviewer seemed most uncomfortable with it. The editor accepted the revised version within 2 weeks. Her dissertation committee passed her, unanimously, 1 month later. The historian who had written the competing analysis for the Hartley Foundation published a formal response to Petra's paper in the same journal 6 months later. It was 2 pages long. It conceded the technical validity of the 47 cross-referenced instances. It argued that the interpretation of systematic fraud was too strong a framing for what might have been systemic negligence. Petra wrote a 1-page reply. She argued that the distinction between deliberate fraud and systemic negligence was not relevant to the workers who had been underpaid, regardless of the mechanism. She argued that the Whitmore Letter, the mine owner's directive to terminate at end of quarter the employee maintaining unauthorized secondary documentation, was not the action of a management structure that believed its practices were within acceptable technical variance. She noted that the gold dust, 43 pounds, 11 ounces, was not a technical artifact. It was physical evidence of a deliberate act of preservation by a man who had been documenting fraud for 8 years and who knew exactly what he was documenting. The journal published her reply. Nobody published a response to the reply. Dr. Chen called her the day it was published. "You know what the best part of this is?" Dr. Chen said. "In 50 years, when someone is writing a dissertation about California gold rush labor practices, they're going to find Solomon Cole's ledger in the state archives, and they're going to find your paper, and they're going to find the historian's response, and they're going to find your reply to the response." A pause. "The conversation is in the record now. It can't be erased." "That was the whole point," Petra said. Dr. Fitch was on the committee. He had asked genuine questions. He had voted yes. Afterward, in the hallway, he stopped her. "I should have engaged more seriously with your initial research design," he said. He said it carefully, as if he had been thinking about how to say it for a while. "The Solomon Cole material validates the broader argument you were making. I wasn't sufficiently open to it when it was still emerging." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for saying so," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not indifference. It was the specific acknowledgement of a correction made too late, but still made. She filed it the way she filed everything. The documentary filmmaker found her in November. His name was Peter Reyes, 35, careful, thorough. He had been following the Bodie story since the spring. He and Petra sat in the kitchen of her Berkeley apartment for 2 hours. The camera was running. He asked about the ledger. She described it. He asked about Solomon Cole. She described what she knew. Then he asked, "Why do you think he did it? Kept the ledger for 8 years. He couldn't have known it would matter." "He was a careful man," she said. "But I don't think it was only carefulness. He understood something about how records work, about what gets into the official account and what doesn't. He was a black man in a professional role in 1877 California. He had specific experience with the gap between what actually happened and what the official record said happened. He'd lived that his whole life." She stopped. "He kept the ledger because he understood that the truth of what he witnessed would only survive if someone made it survive. The official record had already been decided. Someone had to make the other record. Peter wrote something. Then he looked up. There's a phrase from Solomon's note I keep thinking about. I am not a man who forgets what is owed. What does that mean to you?" Petra thought about it. "It means the accounting was wrong and he knew it, and he refused to let the wrong accounting be the only accounting," she said. "Gold doesn't disappear. It just moves from the hands of the fair to the hands of those who know how to stay silent longer." Solomon understood that, and he decided not to stay silent. He just decided to speak in the only language available to him, the language of exact numbers, kept in a hidden drawer, trusted to the future. "What do you think your research changes?" Peter asked. The official record of who built this state, Petra said, and how, and at whose expense. Solomon Cole was in Bodie for 12 years. He was precise and honest and did work that mattered. He should be in the record. He is in the record now. The first time she presented the paper publicly was at a conference at UCLA in April. She had presented at conferences 11 times over 3 years. She knew the specific quality of a room that had decided in advance what it thought of what she was going to say. This room was different. 400 people. Historians, lawyers, archivists, journalists. She had been given 45 minutes. She took 35. Then she took questions. The first question came from a historian she recognized. One of the people who had once suggested her argument about assay fraud was possibly overstated. Dr. Wells, he said, using the title she had recently earned. How do you characterize Solomon Cole's act of keeping the secondary ledger? Was it civil disobedience? Whistleblowing? I think it was documentation, she said. He kept the honest records because the dishonest records were going to exist regardless. Someone was going to produce the false number and put it in the official file. The question was whether the true number was going to exist anywhere at all. He decided it was going to exist. He made that decision every week for 8 years. She paused. I think the larger category is, he was a person who refused to let the official version be the only version, she said, who took personal responsibility for the true account even when the institutional account was not going to reflect it. She looked at the room. That refusal is not dramatic. It is not a single act. It is a discipline. The discipline of maintaining the true measure alongside the false one, day after day, because you understand that if you don't, no one will. The room was quiet for a moment. The historian who had asked the question, the one who had once said her argument was possibly overstated, nodded slowly. He wrote something in his notebook. He looked up. I withdraw the objection, he said, from my review comments 2 years ago. I withdraw it on the record. She had not expected that. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. The room was still quiet. Then someone asked the next question. She had started teaching that semester. The postdoctoral fellowship included a seminar for advanced undergraduates on the material culture of the American West. She designed it around primary sources and fieldwork. On the first day, she asked one question. What is an assay? A few of them knew the technical meaning. The chemical testing of ore. The process of determining the value of what you had extracted. She wrote it on the board. Then she wrote the word's older meaning alongside it. To test, to try, to make an attempt to determine the truth of something. That is what you're going to do in this course, she said. You're going to test the material evidence of how people actually lived in the American West against the accounts we've inherited. You're going to look for the gap between those two things. And you're going to take the gap seriously. One student raised her hand. What if there isn't a gap? She thought about the hidden drawer in the Bodie assay office. About the 7 inches of unaccounted space between the official dimension and the true dimension. There is always a gap, she said. The question is how large it is and who it disadvantages. She received an email from a man named Earl Whitmore in Oregon. His great-great-grandfather had been the head assayer. The Whitmore who had written the 1885 complaint, who had signed the directive that led to Solomon's termination. I found out about this from the documentary, he wrote. I want you to know that I've spent the last 3 months in the county records trying to figure out what I can do. I know there's nothing formal, legally, but I wanted you to know that I know. She read the email twice. She was not sure what to say. She wrote back, Thank you for telling me. Solomon kept careful records. They spoke for themselves. That's what good records do. She sent it. She thought about it afterward. She thought about what it meant that Whitmore's descendants had gone looking, that the documentary had reached them, that they had understood what they were looking at and had found themselves unable to let it sit without saying something. The official record and the true record had been in the same room briefly, and someone on the other side of the official record had acknowledged the gap. That was not resolution, but it was something. She called Ezra when the documentary aired in March. She had watched it in her Berkeley apartment with 2 of her graduate students. Peter Reyes had done what he promised. He had made a film about who gets believed, about who gets to decide what the official version says, and about what happens when they're wrong and someone keeps the records anyway. Solomon Cole appeared 20 minutes in. His name, his work, his 8 years at the Assay office, the photographs, and then the ledger itself, displayed on camera with Dr. Chen describing its contents. Ezra appeared in the last 10 minutes. He sat in his Fresno house with a photograph of Solomon on the table in front of him. A photograph the filmmaker had found that none of them had known existed. Solomon in his 50s, still lean, looking at the camera with an expression that Petra had studied for a long time. He looked like a man who knew something. Not secretive, not burdened, aware. The specific awareness of a person who has done something that matters and has accepted that they will not see it matter in their own time. In the film, Ezra picked up the photograph and said, "He looks like her, the same eyes, same way of looking at something when you've figured it out." Petra had watched that moment twice. Then she had closed the laptop and called her grandfather. He said Petra told him. "You're the engineer," Ezra said. "I'm the archaeologist." "Same thing," he said. "Someone who goes under the surface to read what's there." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. In December, she drove back to Bodie. She called Ezra on the way. She had not planned to call him. She had planned to drive in quiet, but somewhere past Mammoth, with the mountains white on her right and the road long and empty ahead, she picked up the phone. "I'm going back to Bodie," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Tell him I said hello." She smiled. She did not ask who he meant. He told her about Viola on that call, about the 90 years of her life and the 70 of them she had spent, knowing there was something in Bodie and not being in a position to do anything about it. Writing letters to lawyers every few years, just to make sure the deed was still in the trust, just to make sure someone was still holding it. She was doing the same thing Solomon did, Petra said. She was doing the same thing Solomon did, Ezra agreed, keeping the record alive, making sure it didn't get lost. A long pause. "That's 3 generations of careful people, Petra." Solomon. "Viola, you." Solomon kept the ledger. Viola kept the deed. You knew what to do when you got there. She drove through the high desert and thought about 3 generations of careful people. She thought about what it requires to keep faith with something that long. With no confirmation it will ever be useful. With every passing year making it less likely that the world will be organized in a way that can receive what you've preserved. That is a different kind of patience. That is a deeper kind of trust. She had the conversation with Ezra on the drive. Not about the research. Not about the grant or the graduate students or the plans for the research initiative. About Viola. Ezra had been talking about Viola for the past few months since the documentary. About those 70 years of quiet faith in a deed to a building nobody else believed was significant. "You know what Viola used to say?" he said. "What?" "She used to say, the family has property in Bodie," and everyone would smile and nod and think, "The old woman is confused. It's an abandoned building in a condemned ghost town. There's nothing there." He paused, but she kept paying the lawyer. Every 5 years she'd write a letter to make sure the deed was still in the trust. She'd get a letter back confirming it. She'd file it. She'd go back to her life. A pause. She never stopped. Why did she keep it? Petra asked. Because she believed Solomon, as said simply. She had never met him. He died in 1912. She was born in 1905. She would have been too young to remember him. But the family knew. They knew there was something he had left in Bodie. Something that mattered. Viola believed it even when nobody else did. He paused. Your grandmother believed it too. She told me, that building in Bodie matters, Ezra. I don't know how, but it does. Petra drove through the high desert and thought about 5 women across 4 generations, each one saying to the next, this matters. I don't know how, but it does. And Viola writing letters to lawyers until she was 90 years old. She arrived in Bodie in the afternoon. The last 13 miles on the dirt road dusted with thin snow. The town in a shallow bowl between the hills, the same as it had always been, held in its arrested moment. Derek had given her a research access arrangement for the winter. Part of the partnership between the state parks and the new Solomon Coal Research Initiative she was helping to establish. She unlocked the Assay office and went inside. She stopped in the vestibule. The old habit, the pause at the threshold that lets your senses orient. Let the room speak before you move through it. Old wood and stone and the cold mineral smell of the desert winter. No wind inside, just stillness. She walked to the desk. She pulled out her field notebook. Not her laptop, not her phone. An actual notebook with a pen. Some things you think best on paper. She sat down in the chair where Solomon Cole had sat. At this same desk, in this same building, in a town of 10,000 people that was now a ghost. She thought about what an assay was. The precise measurement of the value of something. The determination, through careful testing, of what a thing was actually worth. She had come to understand her own work as the same kind of measurement. Not of ore, of the historical record. You test the material evidence against the official account. You look for the gap. You measure what is actually there against what the record says is there. The desk had measured 19 inches deep. The drawer measured 12. 7 inches of hidden space. 7 inches where the honest numbers had lived for 140 years. She opened her notebook to a blank page. She began to write. She wrote about everything she had learned. About how the physical world holds what people put into it. How the material evidence of a life, the wear on a surface, the hidden compartment behind a false drawer bottom, the cast iron containers behind a section of repointed brick, outlasts the person who made it and outlasts the institution that tried to erase the record of the person who made it. About what it means to read a place correctly, to go into it with the question of what actually happened here, rather than the question of what the official version says happened here. To trust the material evidence over the documentary record when they diverge, because material evidence doesn't lie the way documents can lie. About the specific discipline of people like Solomon Cole. People who maintained their own honest accounts in the margins of a system that preferred a different accounting. Who did it without recognition, without any certainty that it would ever matter, because it was the truth and they were people who understood that the truth required someone to take responsibility for it. She wrote about Solomon Cole and what he had witnessed and what he had decided to do about it. About the workers whose names were in the ledger, the ones she had traced and the ones she hadn't, who had come to Bodie from every direction the 19th century could produce a person from, and had worked in the dark of the mines for wages calculated on numbers that were wrong. She wrote about the research initiative and what it was building toward. About the grant application and the 2 graduate students already enrolled. One working on Chinese labor in the Mother Lode region, one on native Californian labor in the mining camps. Both had come to her after the Solomon Cole paper was published. Both had said the same thing in different words. I've been trying to make this argument without a primary source. Now I know one exists. Can I work with you? She was showing them how. There was always more to find. There was always someone who knew the true number and kept it somewhere. The question was whether someone knew how to look. She wrote about what it means when the measuring is done dishonestly. When the official account of what something is worth is designed to serve the people who control the accounting. She wrote about Solomon Cole's specific act of preservation, about choosing cast iron because cast iron doesn't rust, about placing the containers in a brick platform because brick, properly sealed, maintains a consistent environment for decades, about repointing the mortar to make it look like the rest of the wall, about locking the ledger in the false bottom drawer and making the drawer look like every other drawer. Every one of those choices was deliberate. Every one of them was the choice of a man who understood how preservation works, who understood that the conditions for the truth to be received had to be created by the person who possessed the truth, because the institution was not going to create them. She wrote about Solomon Cole understanding all of that and deciding that the honest number mattered. Even if it only existed in a hidden drawer, even if he would never see it put to use, even if trusting it to the future was the only available form of action. She wrote about the people who came after him. Viola, 90 years old and still writing letters to lawyers. Ezra, quiet and certain. And herself, a 27-year-old archaeologist with $47,000 of student debt and a deed to a building in a ghost town that happened to contain exactly the kind of evidence she had spent 3 years arguing must exist somewhere. You don't know, in the middle of the hard part, what the hard part is preparing you for. She wrote until the December light failed. Then she kept writing by headlamp, because the Assay office had no electricity and the winter afternoon gave up its light by 4 o'clock at this altitude. She was not done. When she finally closed the notebook, the building was completely dark around her, and the cold had come in from the desert floor, clean and sharp and very clear. She could hear the wind in the eaves. She could hear nothing else. She turned off the headlamp. She sat in the dark. It was not a frightening dark. It was a contained dark, the dark of a room that had held something important for a long time and had done its job. She had asked Dr. Aldridge, her Howard professor, a question once in the seminar, where she had first understood what her research was really about. She had asked, why don't people just look at the material record and compare it to the documentary record? Why hasn't this been done systematically? Dr. Aldridge had looked at her for a moment. Then she had said, because it requires training in both. A historian reads documents. An archaeologist reads objects. The person who can do both and ask the question of what happens when they diverge, that person is rarer. A pause. And they're almost always someone who has personal reason to notice the gap, because the gap was already visible to them in their own life, before they had the methodological tools to describe it. Petra had thought about that for years. She thought about it now, in the dark Assay office in December, with her headlamp off and the winter silence of Bodie all around her. She had personal reason to notice the gap. She had asked Ezra once, months before the letter arrived, in the ordinary course of a Sunday phone call, whether he ever thought about why Solomon hadn't come back, why he had left the building to accumulate back taxes for decades, rather than coming back and dealing with it directly. Ezra had been quiet for a moment. I think he was protecting it, Ezra said. From what? From the people who would have wanted to know what was in it, Ezra said. If Solomon Cole had come back to Bodie in 1890 or 1895, filed paperwork, made claims, been visible, someone would have noticed. Someone from the Mine Owners Association, or their lawyers, or their successors. Someone would have asked why this black man from Fresno was interested in the old assay office. A pause. And then someone would have gone in and looked around, and they would have found what was in the desk. Petra thought about that, so he stayed away to keep it safe. He stayed away to keep it safe, Ezra said. He trusted the building to stay standing. He trusted the taxes to stay unpaid. He trusted the county to keep the deed in whatever bureaucratic archive it had ended up in, because the county had no reason to do anything with a $4 deed to a derelict building in a ghost town. Another pause. He trusted the official version's own limitations to protect the true version. Petra sat with that for a long time. The official version had limited attention and limited resources and limited interest in the details of who owned what in a condemned ghost town. The Hartley Foundation had not even known to check the deed records until she filed the access permit. Solomon had understood that. He had used the official version's indifference as a hiding place. She thought about that as she sat in the dark assay office in December. She had been living inside the gap for 3 years. And she had spent those 3 years building the methodological tools to describe it. Because that was what you did when you were inside a gap, and you couldn't get out, and you had to do something. She had learned those tools from Howard, from Berkeley, from 21 research trips and 600 archival photographs, and the specific discipline of sitting with objects and letting them tell you what they were before you decided what they meant. And Solomon Cole had given her the primary source. She had 2 graduate students already. Marcus was writing a thesis on Chinese labor in the Mother Lode region, the material evidence of camps and communities that the 19th century newspaper record had systematically excluded from its illustrations of the gold rush, even as the labor of those communities built the physical infrastructure that made the rush possible. He had come to her because the Solomon Cole paper had shown him a methodology. Read the official record, read the material record, document the gap. He had said, "I need to do this for my community. Can you show me how?" She was shooing him. Yvette was working on native Californian labor in the mining camps. The ways in which indigenous people had been drawn into, coerced into, and exploited by the gold rush economy without appearing in the documents that claimed to record that economy's labor history. She had knocked on Petra's office door 3 days after the paper was published. She had said, "The gap you're describing, the gap I've been looking at for 2 years. But I didn't have a way to describe the methodology. Now I do." Petra was giving them the methodology, and she was learning from them. Each of them was looking at a different population and a different form of the same gap. The gap between the true account of who did the work and the official account of who built the state. Each of them was developing tools that the others could use. The research initiative was applying for a grant from the California Humanities Council, 3 years of funding, 4 field sites, an archive partnership with the Bancroft Library, and a specific commitment to develop the methodology that Solomon Cole had invented informally in a hidden drawer in a Bodie assay office, into a reproducible academic framework for reading the material record against the documentary record and finding the gap. She thought Solomon would have approved of that. He had been a careful man. Careful men, in her experience, liked systems. She was building a system. The December wind moved in the eaves of the assay office. Outside, the ghost town was completely still under the winter sky. Not silent. There was always the wind in Bodie, and the occasional creak of old wood settling, but still. She sat in the dark and thought about what she was building. Then she turned the headlamp back on. She felt, sitting there, the specific tiredness of a good day of work. Not the heavy exhaustion of struggling against something. The clean tiredness that comes from doing something difficult correctly. from using exactly the skills you have, from being exactly the person the situation required. Solomon had spent 8 years in this room. Viola had spent 70 years keeping the deed. Ezra had spent his whole life understanding that something was waiting to be received. And she had spent 3 years becoming the person who knew where to look. That was the inheritance. Not the building, not the $4 deed, not even the 43 pounds of gold. The inheritance was knowing how to look. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she turned the headlamp back on. She put her notebook in her bag. She walked to the door. She locked it carefully behind her. She walked to her car in the thin snow. She started the engine and let it warm. She looked back at the assay office, at the dark frame building in the dark ghost town under the wide winter sky. She thought about the man who had worked in it, and what he had done with what he witnessed, and what it had eventually meant. She drove south. She looked back once from the road at the assay office, at the dark frame building in the dark ghost town under the December sky. A building that had been holding something for 140 years, patient in its arrested moment, waiting for the right person to come and read it. The right person had come. She had done the work. She thought about the assay office in its shallow bowl between the hills. About the way it would look in the morning when the December sun came up behind the Bodie hills and caught the weathered wood of the false front and the ghost of the painted sign still visible in the grain. She thought about Solomon Cole, who had worked in that building for 12 years and had bought it for $4 and had locked what he knew inside it and trusted it to the future. She thought about what he had been trusting when he did that. Not a specific person, not a specific time, just the general proposition that the true account of what had happened was too heavy to disappear entirely, that the physical evidence, the ledger, the gold, the building itself, would outlast the conditions that had suppressed the knowledge it contained, that eventually the right moment and the right person would align. She had been the right person. The moment had been now. She drove south on Highway 395, the mountains on her right going dark, the valley widening ahead, the road long and empty. She thought about what came next. The research initiative had its first grant under review. 2 graduate students. 11 partner sites around California where the same methodology, reading the material evidence against the documentary record, looking for the gap, might yield similar discoveries, similar stories, similar evidence of people who had worked and been cheated and had documented what they knew and trusted it to the future. There was more to find. There was always more. She drove south. She had work to do.